everyone, today we will be making these adorable spooky Halloween initial sweaters. These are going to be on a knit sweater, but you can also make these on any other type of garment. If you're doing these on something like a t-shirt, just make sure to use thread instead of yarn, but I will be going over the yarn version today. These are based off a template I sell on my Etsy with the full alphabet and all of the numbers available, so make sure to go check that out in the description box down below, but let's go ahead and get started. For materials, we are going to need one of my patterns printed off on some sulky stick and stitch. If you've never used this before, it is a water-soluble paper, so it prints off just like a sticker, and then you can adhere it to any garment, and then it washes off with water. You're also going to need some sort of pen or marker. I have an air erasable pen, but any water-soluble marker works as well. I also love the Crayola washables for this because they're easy to find. Next, you're going to need some needles. These are my favorite large eye sharp point needles, and any sort of ruler or way to kind of measure the center, and some weight for yarn. I'll have all these linked down below though. Let's get started with placing our template. I'm just going to go ahead and cut off some of this excess at the bottom with all these extra shapes. I kind of just include these so that you can look at them as you go and to just kind of utilize all the space on the paper. So you can just set those aside and use those for another project or to look at today. Now you can either count the lines on your knit sweater to find the center, or I like to use these little rulers that I have on hand just to kind of make it easier for myself. So I'm going to take my water soluble marker here and I'm going to mark off the center so that I can line up my template. With these knit sweaters, it's kind of difficult because the number of lines to each side of this little ruler can change based off how you kind of stretch out the sweater. So I've also found it's very helpful to just kind of eyeball it. Whatever looks good visually will look best for it, even if it's not considered completely center. I think this looks good, so I'm going to mark off that center and we can go ahead and place our template. So I'm just going to go ahead and peel off the sticker, and then I'm going to line up the line of the template with the line I just created on the sweater. And I like to make sure that that line is right on the collar. I find that works best for most size sweaters. Let's go ahead and get started on our moon, and I do apologize for this shaky video. It will stop, I promise. I just accidentally hit my tripod. So I have about 4 feet of yarn here threaded on my needle, and then note I have a little tail here so that my needle doesn't pop off. We're going to go ahead and get started on this moon here on the bottom, and I'm going to start on one of the points of the moon. I like to start on the bottom here, and I'm just going to poke my needle up right at the tip of that moon and pull it all the way through, stopping when you have about 4 inches of yarn on the back. We'll use this to tie off with later. We're going to be doing a chain stitch here, so we're going to take our garment and place our needle down into that same hole we just created, and then come up about 1/4 of an inch away on the outline of our moon. Note that my yarn is behind my needle so that when I pull through, I get this nice little loop, and I'm going to stop once I feel any bit of tension. Again, down through that same hole, coming up about 1/4 of an inch away and making sure my yarn is behind my needle so that I'm creating these nice little loops. This is a chain stitch, and we will be doing this for the majority of our designs, so make sure you feel comfortable with it. Now I'm just going to chain stitch all the way to the top of our moon, and I'm just going to do one last chain stitch here just so you can see it. So again, going down into that same hole, coming up now along the point of that moon, and then just pulling that through until it's nice and taut. Try not to pull too tight or you can create puckering on your sweater, but I do find the stabilizer helps really well to note when you have pulled tight enough. Now I'm just going to place my needle back down through that same hole. You can kind of go outside of that hole to give it a sharper point if you want, but it's all kind of just personal preference. So I'm just going to stick that down right there. I think that looks good right on the tip of my moon to create a nice sharp point, and I'm going to pull that all the way through. Now we're going to start again, but going down on our moon. So I'm kind of just going to rearrange my garment because I like to always kind of face away from me when I'm embroidering, and I'm going to poke my needle up into the center of that chain stitch. So I'm just poking my needle up again right in the middle of that chain stitch, and I'm going to pull that all the way through and stopping, and then I'm going to start my chain stitch going back down through that second line. So I'm going to go down through the same hole in that chain stitch, and then I'm going to come up outside of that chain stitch. So again, down through and then up outside that chain stitch. Again, making sure my yarn is behind my needle, pulling it through. It may be a little hard here, so I kind of just like to wiggle my needle to get it through, and then pull that through until you're satisfied with your chain stitch. Again, I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of the moon now. Once you're at the bottom of the moon, you are just going to, again, kind of finish off with one last chain stitch, and then you will poke your needle back down into the same hole you created when you started your moon. Pull that all the way through and kind of just evaluate your work, make sure it looks good, because if you don't like it, you will have to kind of cut everything out. You can actually stop here if you want and tie off, but I'm just going to fill in my shape here. So it looks like I can fit one chain stitch length in the middle of my moon, so that's what I'm gonna do. So I'm just gonna pop up here right where the kind of gapping starts in my moon, pull that needle all the way through. I did notice that there was a little bit of an issue on the back. I always like to feel the back of my garments to make sure that I'm not creating these knots, and I felt that I had created one. So I just kind of turned my garment inside out and I'm just fishing it out to make sure it's nice and flat. This is just one of the ways I like to make sure my embroidery is super clean on the back. So once I'm happy with that, I'm again just going to chain stitch all the way up to the top, just making sure that I fill in all those gaps in the center. If you've printed out my exact templates, which are about 6.5 inches high, you should be able to just get this done with 3 chain stitch lengths like I have here. But if you're doing something smaller or larger, you may have to fill in more gaps. Feel free to just do chain stitch or back stitch to fill in those gaps. Once you get to the top of your moon, you are good to just kind of poke your needle back down into it to finish off that chain stitch. There's no rhyme or reason to this, just again, make sure you're filling in all those gaps so you can't see any bit of the sweater. I'm satisfied with how that looks, so I think we can go ahead and tie off. You will notice though that your yarn is a little bit far away from each other, so I'm just going to kind of weave my needle back to my original piece of yarn so that I can tie it off, so that I don't have any large gapping in my tie-offs. So I'm just going to complete this process until I get back to the original yarn piece, tie it off with a triple knot, and then we can cut our excess. Try to leave about 1/4 of an inch of yarn so that it doesn't unravel. But there you go, you just stitched a moon. Next, we're going to get started on our spiders, and I have about 3 feet of black yarn here on my needle, and we're going to come up through the back of the sweater on the abdomen of the spider. So I'm just going to do chain stitch on the abdomen, so I'm going to come up along the outline of that spider abdomen, pulling it all the way through. Again, make sure you leave that tail to tie off with later, and we're just going to be doing chain stitch here. So we're going to go down through that same hole and then come up on the outline of our spider and pull it through. I'm going to be doing about 1/8 of an inch for my chain stitches here. I find that the smaller I work with on these spiders, the more rounded it looks. If you do larger chain stitches, it will start to look a little jaggedy or a little staircasey, so just try to use smaller sections. So again, pulling that through, making sure I'm in the loop, and you'll notice I'm kind of just turning my garment with every stitch. That way I'm really creating this nice rounded effect. So down through that same hole, coming up on the outline of our spider's abdomen. Make sure the yarn is behind the needle so that when we pull through, we get this nice little loop, and there you have it. I'm going to keep going until I get to the first chain stitch of my spider, and then I will show you how to do a continuous loop chain stitch. I think it's a really cool effect for circles, and you're going to need it for a few other factors later, so make sure you're comfortable with it. So once I get back to the beginning, I'm actually going to take the eye of my needle and I'm going to thread it under that first chain stitch I just did. It's very, very difficult to see here on the black yarn. So if you're not comfortable with this, you can just kind of poke your yarn down to make a continuous circle. But if you can't see this, we're just going to go down into the last chain stitch. So thread your needle under the first chain stitch you created and then poke your needle down into the last chain stitch you created. That way you make a full continuous circle. Next, to do the head, we're just going to do one detached chain stitch. So I'm just going to come up along the base of the spider head, go down through that same hole, and then come up along the tip of the spider's head and pull that through. So this is a detached chain stitch, also known as a lazy daisy stitch. I'm just going to pull that through, and then once I'm satisfied with it, I can just poke my needle down to tie off that little chain stitch and make sure it's nice and secure. And that's just kind of how I do the spider's little head. Next, we're going to do the legs, and we're going to do back stitch for these. So I'm actually going to come up along the tip of one of the legs, and then I'm going to go down into one of these joints. I would actually suggest going up through the middle of the joint and then going down to the abdomen and then doing the top leg, because I came into an issue here where I'm kind of trying to go up within the spider's body, and it's really difficult to then work this back direction. So I'm going to show you a better way to do this in the next step, but just any way to do back stitch to get all these 8 legs filled out will be perfect for you. So I'm just pulling that through, and then once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to continue all the way around the spider. So again, this is how I did it a little better. I did the first piece first, and then I kind of finished it off with a tip of the spider's leg, just to make it a little easier on myself, but both methods work. Just kind of fill out all of those 8 legs. Once you're happy with your embroidery, you can turn it over, and again, we're just going to tie that triple knot on the back. So I'm just going to maneuver my needle back to that first piece of yarn, and then I'm going to tie this off with a triple knot, cut off the excess yarn so that I have about 1/4 of an inch of leftover yarn so that it doesn't unravel. And there you have it. You've completed a spider. Now we're going to be stitching our eyeball. So I have 3 different yarns on my needles here. I have about 1 feet of black yarn, 2 feet of green yarn, and 3 feet of white yarn. And we're going to start with the black yarn, and we're going to do the pupil of our eyeball first. So I'm just going to come up along this pupil, and just like the spider, this is a very small space to work with. So I actually only fit 3 chain stitches in here. So going down through that same hole, I'm just going to come up along the along the outline of our eyeball, and it's very difficult to get some of these tiny stitches. If you find it's really hard to pull through like it was for me there, I kind of just like to reset. Sometimes you kind of just snag a wrong piece of yarn and you have to start over. I'm happy with that though, so I'm just going to turn my garment and then again go down through that same hole, coming up along the pupil of my eyeball. It may be a little difficult to see here, that's why I kind of outlined it with marker, but it will be easier to see in person, I promise. I, again, am just going to try to do 1 more chain stitch here before finishing it off with a continuous chain stitch circle. So I was able to fit about 4 chain stitches in for these pupils. So again, once I get back to that first chain stitch here, I'm just going to take my needle and I'm going to go under that both pieces of yarn from my first chain stitch, pull it all the way through, and then I'm going to poke my needle down through the last chain stitch I created. So this is about 4 chain stitches all together, and it kind of will look a little squarish at first, but once you add the next layer of green, it will kind of round out. You're going to complete this exact same process, but this time with the green yarn. So again, I have about 2 feet of green yarn on my needle here, and I'm just going to poke it up along the outline of that pupil, right on the iris, so the green part of the template, and I'm just going to do that chain stitch all the way around. You'll note here that I'm kind of just trying to stay really close to that iris, so that when I kind of pull it in, I'm a little bit over that pupil. That will kind of help to round it off. But again, just chain stitch all the way around, and once you get back to the beginning, you're going to take your needle under the first chain stitch you did. It might be a little better to see on the green part here. Pull that all the way through, and then you can poke your needle down into the last chain stitch you created. This is essentially a reverse chain stitch, and it kind of just helps so that you can't see where you started or ended. Again, you can't really see it on the black, but on these lighter colors like the green, it's very noticeable when you don't do this, so I like to try to do it to kind of make it a little cleaner. Again, with this white yarn, I had about 3 feet of white yarn on my needle, and you're just going to do 2 rows of this, doing the exact same steps that you did for the black and the green yarn. So starting, I'm going to push my needle up along the outside of that eyeball. Again, I would rather focus on the last chain stitch length you did than focus on the template. So in this case, I'm kind of just using the previous chain stitch length of the white yarn to kind of embroider around so that it's nice and clean, and I'm not relying on the outline of the template. This way there's no gapping in the white yarn when you finish it off like I just did here, and it just looks a little cleaner. And then to finish off the eye, before you tie off the white, I just poke it up through the pupil, and then I'm going to poke my needle back down anywhere on the pupil besides the hole you just created. Or you're just doing 1 single stitch here just to create that highlight in the eye to make it a little bit more lifelike. Don't pull too tight though, or you will risk kind of losing that. But there you go, you created an eyeball. Last but not least, our pumpkin. I have about 4 feet of my orange yarn here on my needle, and I'm going to start at the base of my pumpkin right in the middle. So I'm just going to poke my needle up along the outline of our pumpkin right at the bottom, and I'm going to pull that through, making sure to leave a tail to tie off with later. And I'm going to just do a chain stitch along the left side of this first middle segment of pumpkin. So I'm not actually aiming for the outline of the pumpkin. I'm aiming to make my chain stitch fit within the pumpkin segment. And then when I get to the top, I did about 4 chain stitches here. I'm going to poke my needle down right at the base of that stem. This is important because I want all of my yarns to kind of go in towards the pumpkin. And then when I'm at the base again, I'm just going to poke it up along the same hole I just created. I really want all of my yarn pieces to come up close to the center of the pumpkin to round it out. So again, I'm going to chain stitch up. I did 4 chain stitches here, and then I poked my needle down right into the hole of the first chain stitch right at the base of the stem. To do the second segment of our pumpkin, I'm going to come up right along the base of the first set of chain stitches. So again, really close to that first set of chain stitches, go all the way up to the top, and then I'm going to poke my needle down right at the base of the chain stitches again. So that's kind of the deal of this, is you really want these to come up along where you started. So as you see here, I'm using that same hole from the first chain stitch section of this segment to start my second chain stitch length. I don't know if that makes sense, but you can kind of just see visually what I'm doing here. It makes it just look more rounded and really cute. But if these details kind of get a little too troublesome for you, feel free to just kind of fill in the pumpkin as best as possible. I just like to share all these kind of tips and tricks. When I get to the top, I am again going to be stitching down into that same hole I just created. So each segment should start and finish in the same exact holes. So both at the bottom should start in the same hole and end in the same hole at the top. Again, here I'm kind of just finishing off that third segment of my pumpkin, and I'm just going to pull that needle through. And then we can tie off this orange section and get started on our stem. For the stem, I really just have about 1 feet of brown yarn here. I'm just going to be doing 1 satin stitch, so I'm just going to come up along the top of the stem here, pull that through, and then I'm just going to place it down into the base of the stem. I'm actually using the same hole from the chain stitches just to make sure there's no gapping in my pumpkin. You can add more satin stitches to make the stem a little fatter, but I found one looked really cute. To do the greenery of this pumpkin, I have about 2 feet of green yarn, and I'm just going to come up along the base of the stem. So again, the same hole that our chain stitches came into and everything. And I'm just going to pull that through and just do 1 chain stitch here. So go down and then come up about maybe a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch away. And I'm just going to pull that through. So this is kind of a detached chain stitch here. But when I poke it down, I'm going to go a little further away from my hole just to kind of create a pointy leaf. I just find this looks a little cuter for the pumpkin, but it's really just preference. You can stop here, but I love this really cool technique. I've been trying to kind of make a curly Q vine. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to bring it back up along the base of the stem here. And I'm just going to start twisting my needle. So I'm going to go in the same direction as the yarn. So in this case, I'm twisting in a clockwise motion, and you're just going to keep twisting that, and you'll notice it starts to kind of coil up like a vine. I find this looked really cute when I tried it, so I wanted to show you guys what I was doing. Once I'm happy with how coiled it looks, I'm just going to poke it down kind of into the middle of the pumpkin off center, and it will be a little hard to pull this through, I'm not going to lie. But I then like to kind of pull it through, and don't pull it all the way through. See how it kind of just creates this little like coiled line viney effect? I thought it was so cute. You can add a few more of these if you like. And I did find that these washed really well, and it kept that kind of coiled effect. So try out this new technique. Tie off the greenery on the back with a triple knot, and again cut the excess, leaving about 1/4 inch of yarn. And there you have it, a cute little pumpkin. Once you've embroidered all of your stitches, you can go ahead and wash your garment. I actually just prefer to throw these in the washer on a cold, delicate cycle, but if you don't have a washer or you would prefer to just do these in the sink, you can totally do that. I just like to fill up my sink with about lukewarm water, and you kind of just like to rub off all of the sulky stick and stitch. It does kind of tend to stick under some of these symbols, so you will kind of have to rub, especially around the edges of it, just to make sure it's really coming off. I find it takes about 10 minutes to do this in the sink to really get all that sulky off. If you end up washing your garment and it still feels stiff, or you see any kind of like black lingering stains, that just means the sulky hasn't fully rinsed off. So you want to go ahead and try this process again and see if it does any better. But again, I like to just throw these in the washer, but I'm a little lazy. Once you wring out your garment, I like to lay these flat to dry. Please do not put these in the dryer or the yarn will start to fray. I just like to make sure all my elements are super flat when I lay these out to dry. It does take around a day or two to fully dry these sweaters, so just be patient with it, and once it's dry, you are free to enjoy your garment. I had so much fun designing these templates and sharing them with you guys. I really hope you give them a try, and as always, if you have any questions, please leave them down below. If you like this video and you found it helpful, please make sure to like, subscribe, and follow me for more videos just like this. It really helps my channel out. But as always, have fun, have a good day, and happy stitching.